Hello there, and welcome to the Good Old Days of Radio show. This is John Tefteller, your host. It's fall, I guess, or fall soon. It's September, and lots of things have happened over the summer that I don't really take the opportunity to talk about on this podcast, but producer Daniel suggested that I do because there's all kinds of stuff going on within the world of collecting old-time radio that you folks who listen to this podcast probably don't know anything about. And maybe this is not your cup of tea. Maybe you don't find this interesting, but give it a few minutes and see if I can suck you in and hold your attention. And if I can, then we've accomplished something. And if I can't, then just wait until the next podcast and listen to a radio show. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about radio preservation, because all the programs that you hear on the Good Old Days of Radio show and anywhere else that you're out there listening to vintage radio, they all originate on one of two formats, either a 16-inch record called a transcription disc or a 12 or 14-inch reel of old reel-to-reel tape, depending on what time period we're talking about. Transcription discs first started in the late 20s and continued on until the mid-60s. Actually, I've seen transcription discs as late as 1965, 66. But when tape came in, Bing Crosby brought the first Ampex tape recorder over here from Germany in 1946-47, and they began recording the Crosby Show on reel-to-reel tape. You Bet Your Life with Groucho Marx was one of the first ones to also use an early vintage Ampex machine like that. And then other shows followed because tape was a little bit easier to edit and work with than 16-inch transcriptions were. In any case, these gigantic records were made of metal, usually, or glass in the worst case, and they contained 15 minutes per side of any particular radio program that you have heard on this show or anywhere else. There were probably 500,000 to 1 million of them made during what we call the golden age of radio. About 1931 is when they first started using them, and up until, as I say, the late 60s. But most radio is from 50s and 40s and 30s. Over the years, those 16-inch records, they're not indestructible, but they're not easily destroyed. They could be destroyed if you store them improperly. They don't like temperature change. They like constant temperature. Right around 50 to 70 degrees is fine. When you start getting over 70 degrees, it gets a little too warm for them because the lacquer, which is what goes on top of the aluminum to cut the recording, the lacquer will tend to deteriorate if it's in a fluctuating environment. And by fluctuating environment, I mean a garage where it's cold in the winter and hot in the summer and temperature goes up and down. That causes them to deteriorate. And when they start deteriorating, they start getting this white powder on the surface of the grooves. They start flaking off. The acetate or lacquer starts flaking off the metal, and then they're basically destroyed. The bigger destruction from these things comes from humans. Guess what? Humans are responsible because humans don't know what to do with them. Most people have never seen a 16-inch record. It's not something you encounter every day. If you would go to record stores back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, whatever, even today, you'll see a 12-inch LP. That's 12-inch. Imagine 4 more inches and big, heavy piece of metal. Most people who are just casual listeners of vintage radio shows have no clue what a 16-inch transcription disc is, or what you do with it, or how you make it play, or anything. But there are those of us out there that do know that and do have equipment to play them on and try to save as many as possible. I started collecting them in 1972. Over the years, I did sell off some, but I kept most of it. And in the recent years, there has been an increasing number of old-time collectors who have reached their golden age and either passed on or are very elderly and unable to care for all these recordings. And so kind of because I volunteered and kind of because it just has to get done, I've sort of become the dumping grounds for vintage transcription discs and vintage reel-to-reel tape. And I have quite a bit of it, so much so that it's kind of impossible to deal with now. And recently, in the last year or so, I've moved, 10,000 or more radio transcriptions up from Los Angeles from radio show collector Jerry Henniges. Also, I have Marty Halpern's collection here, who used to run Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters, Frank Brzee, who used to do the Golden Days of Radio show for Armed Forces Radio in the 70s and 80s. Anyway, they just keep accumulating, and I try to get what I can to save it. But every once in a while, things don't go so well, because there are people out there, as I was saying, that don't really know what they are, don't know what to do with them, and don't think anybody in the world would want them. And these are usually the relatives, either older or younger, of the folks that saved them in the first place. Usually people who used to work at the radio networks or the advertising agencies, or they were actors or performers, or they had some connection to vintage radio and having transcription discs. They would have them, and then when they passed on, their heirs really don't know what to do with them. And in some cases, they are wise about it, and they contact people, and they get them preserved at least somewhere. In other cases, they just throw them in the dump, throw them in the trash. And what they don't realize is they are trashing things that they're potentially the only copy existing. Recently, there was a post on the internet of a fellow who had 2 Vic and Sades from 1934 and 2 Little Orphan Annie shows from 1933. And he had purchased them at a yard sale for almost nothing. And there they were. And those shows are incredible, and they've never been heard before. And now we've got 4 more never-before-heard shows. Okay, that's how it happens. Sometimes you find a few of them at a yard sale. Sometimes you find a pile of them somewhere. They could be anywhere, any place, anytime. But the main thing is to get them before they are stored improperly, where they just literally fall apart. And then you can try to save them, but you wind up with a bunch of confetti as all the pieces of lacquer fall off of the metal disc, and they can no longer be played. Recently, there was a large collection of transcription discs. The man that had it apparently did not have any real contacts within what we call the old-time radio hobby. He wasn't corresponding with other collectors. He wasn't on the internet. He wasn't doing anything like that. He just had this huge amount of transcription discs, apparently mostly from the 1930s, which is the prime period that's missing. There's a lot of stuff out there from the 40s and 50s, but the 30s is a lot harder to find. Anyway, he had all these transcription discs. He passed away. His family came in and had no clue what they were and had them hauled off to the dump. So there goes, I don't know how many pieces of history that we will never be able to retrieve. And this is a fairly frequent occurrence. And I hate to say it that way, but I would say in the last 10 or 20 years, I've heard a story like this anywhere from once a year to 3 or 4 times a year of things that have just been destroyed and no longer exist. There are success stories. There are people that have things that do take the time to contact somebody and get them taken away and preserved. Most recently, I was contacted by the widow of a collector, and she said, well, I have a large amount of radio recordings. And I said, what's a large amount? And she goes, well, I don't know. It's a lot. Well, come to find out, it's 700 and some boxes of radio recordings with a weight of 27,000 pounds. And the only way to get it from Los Angeles to Grants Pass, Oregon, is through a professional moving company. You could technically do it yourself if you wanted to move 700 and so heavy boxes and put them in 2 or 3 26-foot U-Hauls and drive them from Los Angeles to Oregon. But I'm getting a little old for that kind of thing. And as much as I would do that if I absolutely have to, I didn't absolutely have to. I could pay a moving company a whole lot of money to do it, and that's what happened. But it's an astounding collection. There's a lot of stuff in there that has not been heard since the original air dates, and some of it will find its way onto this podcast at some point. But my overall point is I'm getting buried in this stuff, and I'm just one person. I have a little bit of help from a few people here and there, but ultimately I'm responsible for everything, and it's just piling up and piling up and piling up because I can't bear to see it destroyed. I'm too much of a historian to let that happen. Everybody else might think I'm kind of crazy to fill up storage lockers and warehouses with piles and piles and piles of vintage radio recordings with no end in sight and no plan as to what to do with them. But I don't know what to do. As I say, I'm one person. I can only make so many transfers, and I don't even really do that because I have businesses to run and other things to do. So all we do is we pile them and pile them and pile them. And they're not in any particular order. There's no rhyme, no reason to it. Some of it's good, some of it's bad, some of it's wonderful. I mean, it's all over the place. But it's there. And so in this case, I had to take it because if I didn't take it, this lady was selling the property on which these recordings were located. And if they weren't out of there by a certain date, she was going to have to take whatever she could, trip by trip by trip, to the local dump, and away they would have gone, and they would not exist anymore. So I took on that task, but now I have rented two gigantic storage lockers here in Grants Pass to put them in because I'm out of room in my regular warehouse, and I have 3 other storage units that are also out of room, and they also contain a bunch more radio recordings, records, and other things. So you might think I'm a lunatic. I kind of think I'm a lunatic in a way, but I figure I have to save it. Nobody else is doing it, and that's the sad thing. There's plenty of people that want to hear these shows. The people that listen to this podcast, there's a lot of you out there, and I appreciate every single one of you. And I know that you have your own lives and your own things, and you use this as a form of entertainment, and that's great. That's what it's here for. And I'm not here to ask you to become me. Nobody's going to become me. What I'm hoping is somewhere along the line, the folks who like to preserve vintage film, and there are some very, very wealthy people who like to preserve vintage film. Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, to name a few. And then there are a bunch of people that like to preserve and redo, make available vintage television shows. It seems to be a visual world out there where everybody wants to watch things, whether it's film or TV. But when it comes to radio is like the little brother that you kind of kick aside when you want to deal with the older kids. And that's what's happened. Radio's basically been kicked aside. There are archives. Library of Congress has some. Various institutions and schools have some. There are places that have some, but for the most part, they're inaccessible. In many cases, they really don't know what they have. They just have, like I do, piles and piles of recordings, and they don't have anybody to deal with it. And so it sits and sits and sits. And if it's not stored properly, it's deteriorating. And all that makes me very sad, so I just do the best I can with what I can. But I would hope that there would be somewhere out there somebody with a whole lot of money and a whole lot of interest in preserving this kind of history that could set up some kind of way to deal with it. And I don't mean just taking it and locking it away, even though I'm kind of guilty of that myself, but not deliberately, but to actually be able to have a crew of people to deal with it, where they would be cataloged, they would be transferred to digital, and they could be available. Now, you immediately hear the word available, and a lot of these places run because lawyers have told them, well, you can't really do that because there's a copyright on this and there's a copyright on that. And they're kind of right. But everything is becoming public domain now. We're up to, I think, 1929, because every year it moves ahead one more year. So it won't be long before all vintage radio becomes public domain, but it may not be in my lifetime, because by the time you go from where we are now at 1929 up to 1960, well, that's quite a ways down the line, and at 65, I don't know if I'm going to make it there. But in any case, all that could be sort of shoved aside, all those copyright worries and all that kind of stuff, and deal with it. Find out who owns it, deal with it. Don't just let it languish. Don't just let it deteriorate. Do something with it. You might wonder how many people are out there like me with collections like this who have this kind of thing. There are some, very few. And I don't know of anybody that has the volume that I do. I just don't. Library of Congress does, yes. Things like places like that will have volume. But private collectors, private people who've kept the stuff over the years, usually they have a few hundred transcription discs, sometimes a few thousand, but mostly not. Most people are content with just having. Originally it was reel-to-reel, then cassettes, and now it's digital files with radio shows on them, and listen to them. There's a couple people out there that I know that are transferring shows and doing it, but they have jobs, they have lives, just like I do, and they don't have a lot of time to do this, although they're doing some. And I appreciate everything they're doing, because somebody's got to do it. But what you really need is you need a large crew whose life is dedicated to that, and they don't have to split their time between their families, their work, their free time, and all that, and suck up all their lives just dealing with vintage radio recordings. And of course, we could do nothing. We just let all this go to rot and ruin, and it's over. But I don't want to let that happen, and I'm trying not to. So I've described to you the situation with 16-inch transcription discs, which are basically oversized records, as I said. Reel-to-reel tape presents a whole different problem. And a lot of radio from the 50s and late 40s was recorded on reel-to-reel tape. Most of it 10-inch studio tape or even 14-inch studio tape. That audio tape breaks down a lot quicker than a transcription disc, and is much more subject to decay and destruction than a transcription disc. I mean, I have my own sets of reel-to-reel tapes here that I made from transcription discs back in the 70s and 80s. I stopped transferring transcription discs like that around 1987, so everything here is before 1987, which is now almost 40 years ago. Well, some of that tape has begun to deteriorate, even though I have kept it very well stored for the past 40 years. You cannot count on that stuff staying good forever. A transcription disc, if you store it right, yeah, it seems like they'll store for 50, 60, 70 years. I have stuff from the early 30s that looks like it was made yesterday and still sounds good and isn't deteriorating. But reel-to-reel tape deteriorates, and what happens to it is it dries out over the years and becomes brittle, so it starts breaking, and then it does something even more insidious. It sheds. The oxide, I believe it's called oxide, that's used to coat the back of the tape begins to just flake off as you're playing the tape back. And when you're playing the tape back and you see this black stuff start to accumulate on your reel-to-reel tape recorder rollers, you know that you're losing tape. And what you're losing first is the very high-end frequencies of the program. That's the first thing that goes when that oxide starts shredding. So it begins to sound a bit muffled. If you bake it, and there's a whole other set of problems, but you can't actually bake the tapes. Yeah, everybody out there is going, what is he talking about, baking tapes? You have to literally put them in an oven to a certain temperature, bake them so that you're reattaching that oxide to the backside of the tape. And once you do that, you can play it through and it won't shred, and you can get a good transfer to digital off of it. So a lot of vintage tape is, they call it squeaking, they call it shedding, they call it just deteriorating, and it is. And as I say, even under the best of storage conditions, it's going to occur after a certain period of time. So the race is on to save transcription discs. The race is on to save reel-to-reel tape. Which comes first? What do? I don't know. And a lot of the collection that I just picked up is actually reel-to-reel tape masters from the 1950s. Bob and Ray and all kinds of stuff like that on actual original reel-to-reel studio masters. I haven't tried to play any of them yet. I assume they will play. The question is, will they shred, and will we be able to get a good digital transfer? I don't know till I start working with it. But again, I don't have time for all this. I don't have time to sit there and deal with all this. So I'm just storing it, and that's a bad it's a bad thing and a good thing. It's a good thing I'm storing it. It's a bad thing I'm storing it. Because the longer it sits without being dealt with, the worse it's going to be when you try to deal with it. So I'm trying to sort of send a plea out there to somehow find a way to deal with all this before it all turns to dust and it's no good. And maybe that doesn't matter to you. Maybe you just want to hear the programs. Well, fine, but you're not going to hear any new programs that you've never heard before if we don't manage to save all this stuff and somehow get it off that reel-to-reel stuff and onto some kind of digital file. The downside of digital files, well, if you have a computer and you know about that, you know your hard drive will fail. And you can back it up and the backup will fail. And you can back it up again and that backup will fail. So we're going round and round the mulberry bush. Yes, you can transfer it to digital, but you're going to have to retransfer it every 5 years before your hard drive crashes and it's no good anymore. So that's a different problem. The safest and best way to store audio is not digital or tape. It's actual recordings. It's actual discs. Either cut it to 78 RPM, cut it to 33, but cut it to some kind of physical disc that is not going to deteriorate anywhere near as fast as reel-to-reel or digital. But there's a different problem. So now that I've described to you all what these things are, what the deterioration is, what the issues are, there's really no immediate answer. I can think of one, I can dream of one, and the dream would be something to the effect of what Ted Turner came along and did by purchasing the MGM library and then establishing Turner Classic Movies on television. Now, that's not exactly preservation, but it is in the sense that the films then become transferred from the original 35 millimeter to some form of digital that can be presented on television or run in movie theaters. But it's at great expense. You need somebody with massive amounts of cash who is not looking to really make any money. There's not really any money to be made in this stuff. There's history to be saved. That's an important work. But if there's no money to be saved, people don't tend to think much about it other than, oh, well, hope somebody does it. And yeah, that's great. I hope somebody does it too. But hoping and dreaming and wishing and all that isn't going to help much. It's a nice thing that you're thinking that way, and great, think that way, and maybe something will happen. But we need action, and we need action from a individual or a group of individuals that will get together, pool their funds, and establish a place where all this stuff could go and then be transferred and available to the public. And that's where it becomes sticky, because the lawyers might tell you you can't make it available to the public. And even with my stuff, if somebody tells me they want it, but they can't make it available, I'm not giving it to them. I'm not thinking about just leaving this stuff in some building somewhere with no access. Although that seems hypocritical, because right now it's sitting in my building with no access. But at least I know that there's a plan, and if somebody came up with it, I'd be one of the first to help them make it a reality. But you need a lot of money to do this, and you need a lot of dedicated individuals who need to be trained on how to handle them, how to transfer them to digital, and then how to preserve that digital. Once you get that, okay, you've got that. Now you've got 3 or 4 or 5 years, you got to redo the digital all over again. So it's a very wild and crazy problem. It's probably something that most listeners of this podcast are not really interested in, but maybe I've been able to explain it in a way that now you are interested, and maybe something will come of this. I don't know. But I thought I would take one episode and just kind of update the listeners as to how all this stuff happens. How do you get to hear these vintage programs? Where do they come from, and how can we hear more? I get that question all the time. Well, can we hear more of this show or more of that show? Well, in some cases, yes. They just need to be transferred and available. And in other cases, no. They've been lost. They've been destroyed. They don't exist. And that's a bad thing. I don't like giving that answer, but unfortunately that's what I have to do sometimes because they simply don't exist. Or if they do, they're hidden away in some attic or barn or closet or somewhere where nobody knows where they are. And when that person passes away, we're either going to have a success with them providing them to people who know how to deal with it, or we're going to have another failure and more stuff is going to go to the dump and be lost. So that's just the way it is. I have no other answers. Okay. This is John Tefteller in the Good Old Days of Radio Show. We'll be back with real radio shows, and I won't bring this stuff up again for a while, I guess. But we'll see. Sometimes it creeps in my brain, and I have to let it out. So here we go. All right. See you next time on the podcast, and thanks for listening.